Hello, everybody, and welcome to Free Kiwis. Today, we're delighted to have our friend Damien Grant here. He is the 24th most popular columnist for Stuff, and he is also a career liquidator. So, welcome to the show, Damien.
Thank you.
Can
Yes.
you tell us a little bit about how you got into this sort of dual career of popular columnist for Stuff and also a liquidator?
Well, the insolvency, I had a company that we liquidated. There was four of us, and I wasn't very happy with the behavior of the liquidator in question. I was a consultant at the time, and I thought, well, I went to complain. I realized it was a completely unregulated Wild West industry and that any idiot could be a liquidator. And
What a good thing.
I'm an idiot. So I charged straight into it. Ironically, it subsequently became regulated, which is a story in itself. And I began writing for the Herald on Sunday. A journalist there, editor at the time, Maria Slade, asked me to write a bi-weekly column on business, and it seemed to go well. Well, I don't know, but Maria left, and I think they just kind of forgot that I was there. So I kept submitting the columns, and then over time it just so I'm an accidental liquidator and an accidental columnist, but now I seem to be popular at both.
Well, one of the things I find interesting about your stuff columns is there's a disclaimer every week saying that you write from a libertarian perspective. They don't seem to feel similarly obligated to point out that others write from a,
Progressive.
social democrat
Yeah.
perspective or whatever they are.
To be fair to stuff, I think on the online stuff, I think it's only me and Verity Johnson who write for the actual stuff on a consistent, regular basis, and I think they have a similar disclaimer with from her.
Oh, okay.
But
What does it
I
say
don't.
under her columns? I haven't seen that. I don't remember seeing that. You may be
I
right.
think she says she does not write from a libertarian perspective. Verity is a great writer. She's funny. I enjoy her writing style. I think they describe her as a business owner in Auckland. Uh, but I don't think it's a bad thing. If you say that I'm writing from a libertarian perspective, it does. If you understand that, then it helps explain where I'm coming
Well, it
from.
makes it a bit better that Verity has it too, because I always had the impression, like Michael, that you were the only one. You were being singled out.
No, well, I think when they reordered it, I think a lot of the columnists were pushed down to the various mastheads, like at the Post and the Waikato Times and stuff. So I think we were the only two they decided to keep um, regular columnists on the actual stuff thing. People do point that out, and people get, but I think it's fine. I don't have a problem with it. There are so many other ways they could describe me. I think
Many of them less flattering than libertarian.
so, and it's not. I don't. I am a libertarian. I do write from a
Fair
libertarian
enough.
perspective. So
Yeah.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, we want to talk about regulation. You just said something about regulation. So one of the things we want to talk about, you have so many interesting columns, but we looked at a few of them and picked out three. And one of them was about this recent case of a woman called Janet Dixon. She's a real estate. Actually, she's not a real estate anymore. She was a real estate agent. She's not a real estate agent anymore. And the reason is because she had some compulsory training course called Te Kakano, which was a course that covered Maori culture, language, and Treaty of Waitangi. And she refused to do this course. And then she was, I believe, struck off as a real estate agent. Is that right?
She was. There was. It was. This is. There was absolutely no reason why she was required to do that course. It was. My understanding is, which I've since learned, I didn't realize at the time, it was just a one-off. So they did it for that particular year, and then following years they had other ones. The there was an opportunity that the regulator had to give her a waiver if for I think it was extraordinary circumstances. And it's arguable whether this was in fact extraordinary circumstances, but they had discretion, they could have done it. I think the reason why they didn't do it is when you give somebody with no authority or power and you give them authority and power, they feel the need to use it.
They find a way to use it if they haven't got one.
Yeah, and I think she defied the petty bureaucratic tyrants who ran that organization, and they feel, well, if we don't have the power to make her do this thing, well, what power do we have? And it was I don't even think it was ideological. I just think
Yeah,
it was
that's an
petty
interesting thing.
bureaucratic.
I sort of picked up this vibe from university administrators as well. It's like, do they actually believe in the ideology? And is the insult to the ideology if you sort of don't back down, or is it to them? Because they almost can use the ideology as a litmus test for who's going to bow down to them. And
Yes.
if you argue against the ideology, it doesn't matter so much, but you're arguing against them, and that's something that they don't like.
Well, this is why it's very important that Winston Smith said that 2 + 2 = 5.
Mm.
It's not that he believes it. It's not that O'Brien believes it. It is that we are making you say something that you know is not
It's
true, and it's about the power. You're right.
yeah.
It's not about the ideology. It is
Yeah.
about the exercise of authority.
It's a very sinister thing, actually, when you start to examine that. And I think it was an insight people like Goebbels had as well, that if you can force people to falsify what they believe, then you kind of got them. Because now,
To be fair, I don't want to compare the real estate industry's
no,
behavior with Joseph Goebbels.
but Hannah Arendt wrote The Banality of Evil and
Yes, she did.
about Eichmann, and I think that's very insightful. You don't have to be, a thoroughly evil piece of crap to do these things. You just have to be a kind of amoral bureaucrat who's going along with whatever.
It's a hell of a segue, but I do think it's interesting. I don't think it was Hannah Arendt that said this, but it's interesting. You look at some of the people who committed these terrible crimes. They were living relatively normal, uninteresting lives.
Mm.
They became monsters, and they turned up 20 years later in Argentina after the war. They again lived relatively boring, uninteresting lives. And the thing that worries me is how, would I be like that? What the only difference between tyranny and obedience is opportunity. And who was it? Is it Prager?
Dennis Prager.
Yeah, one of his little mantras is, "It is a mistake to believe that human nature is fundamentally good. That the reason why that there is a huge amount of socialization." He attributes it to Christianity, but I don't disagree with that. But I do agree that society, why do we have society? Why do we have these rules? And we have these rules because human nature is not fundamentally good, and we need some sort of a mechanism by which to discourage people from. And what happens the minute you look in a war situation? The minute the rules are off, what is the first thing that happens? Crimes of violence, crimes of sexual abuse, looting. The minute that the veneer of civilization is gone, you see our true nature.
Hell breaks loose.
How we got there from the petty bureaucrats at the
Well, let's just go back, because I feel like we're being a little bit, as you say, we're being a little bit unfair to the real estate authority, because
they are not Nazis.
Not only are they not Nazis, to be fair, but so did this Kakano course even include stuff that was mandatory and just outright false, or was it just sort of annoying stuff? Because I mean, presumably if they're teaching Maori language, little Maori expressions and phrases, those aren't like completely the wrong phrases. It's just the annoyance is just that. The question is, should a real estate agent be required in New Zealand to do a course on Maori culture and language?
It's kind of a more fundamental question, which is whether a real estate agent should have to have any kind of credential or license at all. I mean, why shouldn't anyone just be able to sell someone's house for them if they ask them to?
Yeah, and if there was a market need for sensitivity in relation to cultural issues, I would imagine that people are going to be sensitive to that. So if I am dealing with somebody and their culture mandates that I take the shoes off, if I want the sale, I'm going to take the shoes off.
And you're incentivized to do that yourself. You're motivated to do that and to find out what you need to do.
Yes, and it's not difficult. You just this thing called the internet, where all the computers are connected together, and I'm pretty sure that even a real estate agent, which aren't necessarily always the sharpest tools in the shed, but I'm pretty sure that self-interest would allow them to look that stuff.
I'm sure it would. And, these licensing arrangements open the door to what you were talking about before, which is, here's a bit of power. By all means, find a way to exploit it and make someone's life a misery just because you can. I noticed the Pharmacy Council has now got a similar kind of requirement for to be a registered pharmacist. You need to show that your business is making progress towards cultural competence.
So far, we don't have that in the insolvency industry, but
I'm sure it's coming for you, mate.
I've had my own regulatory struggles with them. But now I'm a card carrying member, so I shall not bring the industry into disrepute.
You better not.
I want to keep my card.
Right. So, I mean, I guess this is just a segue into the whole topic of free speech in New Zealand, and I'd be interested to get your views on this. You're a columnist, you're in Stuff, probably the main news website, but you're pretty iconoclastic. Have you had any troubles? I mean, besides this possible thing of having a byline under your articles that nobody else has, except for maybe Verity Johnson. But besides that, how much blowback do you get within Stuff, outside of Stuff? Is it sort of cruisy or
Do you get hate mail, death threats, that kind of thing?
The I don't think it would be fair to Stuff to talk about the internal discussions that I have. Stuff have been very good to me, and but it's fair to say Stuff have a worldview, and it's their publication, and they are entitled to set the boundaries of the topics that they are happy to have people write about and not write about, and I.
But there are boundaries.
Of course, there are boundaries. Absolutely,
And any publication will have some boundaries.
There is not a publication on the planet that would not have
Would you characterize these boundaries as broad, or?
Yes, yes, they are very broad, and they evolve over time, obviously, as sensitivities and views change, and that's because Stuff is it's a commercial operation, so they need to operate with an environment. There are advertisers, they have subscribers, so they need to be sensitive to the commercial realities that exist. And if I want to be a part of that organization, and I do, then I need to respect their culture and their values, and I do.
So perhaps to get out of certain sensitivities you have to respect, since you're some kind of.
But that's not just within Stuff. That is just more generally. There are a number of topics that I might think, I'd like to write about that, but I choose not.
You choose not to.
Not because I write for Stuff necessarily, but there is just things that I don't feel are helpful to say.
Yeah, which may nonetheless be true, or you may believe them, and so on.
It may absolutely be true, but there are, an example might be, if somebody says, the classic example, what do you think of this dress? You say the dress is lovely,
just lovely, and you look lovely in it.
There is no. I despair sometimes when I see people making statements that maybe they're true, maybe they're not, but I feel that people are making statements for the purpose of causing harm and creating mischief. And I
although of course that's probably what people think of you, right, in your columns.
That I create mischief.
Sure, you're causing trouble. You're being provocative for no reason. I don't think
you're saying things that some people disagree with.
I would say that I say things that are provocative, but in my defense, I would say that I do them for a reason. Right? So last weekend I was very critical of the Prime Minister and his handling of the resignation of Andrew Bailey. I thought he should have supported Andrew Bailey. That's probably cost me, some political access. But I think it was an important thing to say. And I'm fortunate to have the position to say it. There are other, like, it took me a while to get my head around the whole cash report issue. That was fairly unpopular, but I think it was an important thing to say.
Mm. You wrote a column on that, did you?
I didn't actually pay much attention to the whole trans thing.
So we should probably make clear to the listeners. So the CAST report was this major review of sort of trans medicine done in the UK, right, by a fairly senior medic.
It resulted in the Tavistock clinic being closed.
Yeah, and it basically concluded that we don't have enough information on a lot of these procedures, and we should be much more cautious, right? And we should pull back from some of these interventions, especially for youth, basically people
for minors.
Minors, that's right. Yeah,
and that parents should be consulted if anything is to happen with their children.
Yeah,
but see, that is probably an issue where it was on the periphery of my attention. I didn't pay it much attention. I did. Part of what got me there was I interviewed a guy called Graham Linehan.
As we did on Free Kiwis.
Yeah, he's a past guest of ours.
And he kind of blew his life up over the issue. And there was, looking back now, from there must have been some cowardice on my part, because I looked at people like him and I said, "You are destroying your life on this issue," and I didn't. But when I actually said, okay, I need the cash report came out, and then I read it and I said, okay, I need to. This is something that I need to. And it's fair to say um, that was something that staff had to think about. It was kind of like, okay, this is. I think that was a bit of an area that they hadn't gone before. But to their credit, they looked at what I'd written in light of the cash report, and they published it. And I think that was the right thing to do. Uh, but I mean, that was that was probably a case of something that was provocative, but I think it wasn't provocative just for the sake of being provocative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's one of the issues that we did this big report on academic freedom in New Zealand universities.
Yes.
And survey after survey suggests, and also sort of anecdote after anecdote suggests that is it's not actually the number one issue
The
that
treaty is the
academics and
number one
students
issue
feel
that they're
inhibited
scared to
talking
talk
this
about.
treaty. But that's the number two issue is gender/sex and all that kind of.
And in some ways,
stuff,
it goes back a little bit to what we were saying before, because any biologist who was speaking honestly would say that in biology, there are two sexes. You can go back to some asexual species, but basically most of the species on the planet have two sexes.
Yeah.
And so to say that the sex is a spectrum, or that there are all these other sexes or whatever, is one of those things where people are kind of falsifying what they know to be true in order to satisfy.
Okay, but let's just come back to that. But is that really a free speech issue? So the prohibition on topics like that, that's not when we think about free speech. The default is we think about some sort of legislative restriction. There is no legislative restriction.
That's not the way John Stuart Mill thinks about it in On Liberty, for example. I mean, a lot of the classical thinkers on free speech think about it as a social thing as well as a legislative thing.
Okay,
right?
all right. So fair enough. I'm not not competent enough to debate on that, but I would say it cuts both ways. So I mean, I'm confronting an issue at the moment where somebody I'm involved with is saying things that for me are unpalatable, and I'm not going to infringe on that person's free speech, but I'm going to potentially disengage from an association as a direct result of the things that they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, in a sense, that's my free speech.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's
certainly your liberty to interact with this person or not. I think there is
and why is that not the case with gender? So if you go out,
it is.
I think it is.
It's got to reach a certain bar, though. I think. I mean, you obviously don't want to talk about all the details, but like, I would hope that this is a very serious thing. You've thought about it a long time. If you're kind of not going to be friends with this person, you probably thought about that quite deeply. And I think that what Mill and people were trying to say is that it's better to have a society in which we can maintain the bonds of friendship and we can maintain civil exchange of ideas for a very broad range of topics. Right?
I would say
the scary thing about the last few years is just that the range of topics, the Overton window has shrunk so dramatically, right? And there are all these things that we used to be able to talk about 5 or 10 years ago, which we're not able to talk about.
And there's a general tendency for the temperature to get very high very quickly when you talk about certain things, which didn't used to be the case. I think,
but why?
Why is
it just postmodernism?
I don't think it's just postmodernism. My particular take on it is that it has something to do with the distance in time since democracy was last seriously threatened. So if you go back, World War II, you had Nazis, you had the Soviet Union. Obviously, Soviet Union and the Western democracies were victorious in that war, and fascism was defeated. It kind of persisted for a while in Spain and a few other banana republics, but really that was the end of that form of authoritarianism. Communism, state communism, persisted until 1990 or so as a serious kind of challenger to the democratic world order, and then it was gone too. I mean, that's now 35 years ago, so we've had half a lifetime since Western democracy, liberal, open society has been under serious threat. And I think once you've got a generation or two who have grown up in a kind of complacency that this is the way it always is, this is the way it's always been and always will be, you get lazy about the things that are required to maintain the open society, because it's not self-maintaining. I think that's what we easily forget. I've grown up my entire life in a liberal democracy, and until certain things started happening about 8 years ago, I think, Don Brash being banned from Massey campus was a wake-up call for me. I'm kind of more easily woken up than some, perhaps.
You're woke.
Yeah.
You're woke. Well done.
I certainly got a shock, and then I realised actually this is a value that we have to defend. And then I started to look into it, and I realised actually the idea that you listen openly to people you disagree with hasn't really been the historical norm. The kind of default human setting is to form warring tribes and have it out, literally with physical violence. And we've been very lucky to have a time when that hasn't been so. But I think we take
this
for
is
granted
kind of
as our peril, and I think that it is in decline now. And because we haven't paid enough attention, especially I would say to educating young people about how to have conversations.
Okay, I want to push back on that.
Yeah.
Is it in decline? Because whatever it is that you are interested, whatever your views, whatever your views on gender, race, politics, economics, whatever, there is the opportunity, and there has never been a greater opportunity to find the things that you're interested in, find a community of like-minded people on any topic that you're interested in. The one thing that maybe, and I don't know this is necessarily so much of a change. There is a maybe there's two Overton windows. There's the Overton window of polite society and the Overton window for the
what you can say legally or something like that.
The unregulated sewer of social media.
Yeah.
So, but why are you? So,
I mean, one piece of evidence is that you can ask people questions in surveys. They did one in the States where the question was quite broad. It was something like, do you feel that you're able to speak your mind? And the percentage of Americans who answer yes to that is lower than in the days of McCarthy, right? And we have all this surveys from universities and students, and I compiled a lot of them in my report, that show you ask similar questions to people at universities, and the numbers go down on that. And if you try and collate episodes of academics being threatened for their job or disciplined, those things go up. So I think there's a lot of solid evidence, but I agree with you. I agree with you that there's also this proliferation of different fora online, and it's very interesting that those two things coexist. But I think one of the problems is, I mean, when the internet first came about, a lot of sort of conventional liberals were really excited that it would allow everybody to sort of speak their minds and explore various intellectual topics. And it has done that, but at the same time, it's actually provided channels for various types of social sanctioning. Right? And we saw that with sort of cancel culture. So it allows me to go online and say, I think this about Maradona or Velasquez. It also allows me to go online and say, I read Damien Grant's column the other day, and I think he's a terrible person, and I want him to get fired from his job as a licker.
The other thing is, I think it drives tribalism in a way. I mean, certainly there are all these little niches where you can go and find, as you say, like-minded people. No matter how weird or extreme your views, you can find other people who believe that, and then you start talking to them, and reinforcing those beliefs. But what there is too little of is kind of open-minded and good faith engagement with people who disagree. And again, there's some relevant data here out of Pew Research in America, who, I don't think it's annual surveys, but they do surveys quite often over time on what Democrats think of Republicans and what Republicans think of Democrats. And if you go back to 1990, they thought quite highly of one another. Really, they were happy for their children to marry one another and to have them over for dinner and go out for a drink with them and all of that. Over time, the two distributions have pulled apart, and more they think that the opposite side is stupid and ill-motivated and all of these kinds of things, and don't want anything to do with one another.
Possibly both correct.
So you get the breadth of views is there, but the polarization has increased, and the engagement across views has diminished.
So if we're talking about those, I think those are two issues. You've got the free speech on one hand. And you've got the intensity of the polarization. I just want to come back, but why do you think, when you're both academics, you're in this field, why do you think there has been that change since the 70s and now where there is that that cost?
There are a lot of reasons. I mean, I think social media is one, like that
Mm.
capacity that I've just mentioned for social media to act as, if people talk about the global village, and the internet has made the world a global village, at least everyone
I think
online
it's
a global village.
especially at
But
first.
one aspect of the global
Yeah.
village is that villages can be very kind of traditional places where people take it out on each other for what they've said, and it's very gossipy. And the internet has reproduced that. There are a lot of other, we've been trying to answer this question on Free Kiwis
It's a
the whole
complex,
time,
it's a
but
hard
we keep coming
question.
back to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing I wanted to say, just coming back to the trans thing for a moment, is that I think some of these conversations, some of these topics have particular reasons why they're so poisonous. And I think in the trans case, there's something about people who want to have you say something about them, right? So in their case, it's not just like,
Let me be
let's talk
how I
about
am.
God, the nature of God or
Yeah.
whatever. It's sort of like, it is intrinsic to my identity that you use the word she for me, right? If I declare myself Delia or whatever, I'm sincere sort of trans person, I want to be known as Delia, then you saying that I'm not Delia is actually deeply hurtful to me. And I don't think we should be dismissive of that. I think that for a lot of people, that's a serious thing. We should consider it. But that makes it very difficult when it comes to free speech, right? Because it's very much like those people feel it as an attack on their identity. It's not the case for all trans people. I have at least one trans friend who's very pro free speech and is able to talk about these things in a very level-headed way. But I think that's one of the things that makes that topic particularly poisonous.
And it becomes compelled speech then, especially if it's embedded in law as it has been in Canada, or even if, as it is in UK, it's not embedded in law, but the police will still come around and accuse you of a non-crime hate incident that gets recorded. Now, we've avoided that fate in New Zealand, thank goodness. But, you know, I still think there is a cultural issue, and I you know,
but that's it. It's culture. It's
yeah,
culture.
and
Culture is evolving.
that culture is evolving, and I think it's perfectly reasonable for an individual to say, actually, I find this person's views so offensive, I don't want anything to do with them. That's just life.
That's fine.
I agree, that's fine, but I also think that if that attitude gets too widespread and too narrow, and we're too ready to ostracize one another or kind of sever ties with people because of disagreements, then I'm not saying that this is something that we can even do much about directly, but it starts to undermine the foundations of open society.
Yeah, and what's wrong with us
predicated
saying,
on the
say
ability
it's
to
just social, that's fine. Okay, maybe it's only, I actually disagree with that, but imagine it's just a social phenomenon. Then we have a right to say, well, we don't like that social phenomenon. So just like, everyone starts being a fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, and I don't like that, I can try and convince them that actually Montreal is a much better team, or whatever it is, right? Everyone's becoming a Buddhist. I say, no, Christianity's better. So in this situation, people are getting much more inhibited about their speech, much more liable to punish others for their speech. But we're saying
I said it's
that's
cultural.
not a good thing.
I didn't say it's just cultural.
Okay, well, let's see.
Cultural.
So on the legislative front, you admit there are some changes there too, right?
I think that the proposed the Paul Goldsmith sending to the Law Commission was just a huge mistake.
That's hate crime.
He shouldn't. He shouldn't have even opened that door. And that's, who was it that said politics follow culture? Politics is downstream of culture.
I can't remember who.
Breitbart.
It's a good line though. Yeah.
But I think that's why I didn't say it's just culture. It's culture. So the culture has moved to the point where we are less tolerant of divergent political views, and that's why hate speech laws, which would have been politically unacceptable 30 years ago, are now on the agenda. And a conservative administration, a nominally conservative government, is considering hate speech laws that Helen Clark probably would not have considered. And so that evolution has been happened quite quickly. And I think that is a result of a cultural shift.
Yeah.
But what I don't wrap my head around, I'm not too sure that it's necessarily social media, but
it's not only social media. There are multiple causes.
Something has changed.
Yeah.
And I can't quite.
Well, I also think you and I are a similar age. I was at primary school in the 1970s, and my teachers, they were too young to have fought in World War II, but their parents did.
Yeah.
And we were educated about the Holocaust when I was about 9. I knew all about Nazis and the dangers of totalitarianism at that age. And so I grew up with that in the air, and New Zealanders at the time did. And I think it made us aware of the potential fragility of democracy and open society, and more alert to threats to it. And the idea that you couldn't say what you wanted I mean, it would have just occurred as utterly bizarre to me.
Okay, well, let's no. So let's come back to that.
Mm,
There would have been things in the 70s that would have been socially unacceptable to say.
absolutely, there would. In some
Like,
ways,
I'm
quite.
gay.
Yeah, like I'm gay.
Yeah,
I mean,
like I was
being,
gay. Yeah,
being
that,
gay in the 1970s was no bloody picnic, that's for sure.
yes,
So,
yeah.
I mean, some things have demonstrably got way better in that kind of way.
Is it possibly the case that because we are tribal, is it possible that we are constantly looking for something to differentiate somebody on for the purpose of ostracizing them? Is that an inherent part of who
Yes.
we
Yeah,
are as humans?
and
That's
also,
probably true,
like,
yeah.
I mean, there's more to it than just ostracism because it tightens the group you belong to. So
Yeah.
it's saying that tribe over there is bad, our tribe
Yeah.
is good, and we define our goodness by not
Okay,
being
that's
them.
interesting.
So
Yeah.
that's a really big one. That's
But
a well-known
yeah,
social phenomenon. And then there's also just wanting to conform to the people around you. And that's another well-known social phenomenon. I think of Solomon Ash's experiment where he had, the one where he had this thing that was purportedly an experiment about judging the lengths of lines. But most of the
Yes.
purported participants were actually his Confederates, and they'd
The
all say,
the one guy who was
yeah,
the
that's
real
right. So
expert would disagree.
they'd say, oh, those lines are different when they were obviously the same, or different the same when they were obviously different. And
Yeah.
the poor real participant at the end would say they're the same.
but as long as you had one person saying that they're
if
not
you
the
had one
same,
person,
then everybody
one
else or a lot of
Confederate
other people
who
would do it.
dissented, then yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
But
I deploy that.
it's very
So
helpful, yeah.
if I'm in a creditors meeting and there's a vote and I want it to go one way, first thing I will get all of the people who are going to vote the way I want, and I will get them to vote first because I get to choose,
Very
right?
Because it
clever.
signals, yeah.
So ding,
Yeah.
ding, 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 ding,
Yeah, yeah.
and then I two or three of the people they'll usually fold. So you you can almost rank them
Yeah.
and say, well, that guy's on the fence. I've had 15 votes one way, and now I'll ask that guy on the fence, and then he prevaricates, and then
Yeah.
and
It's
that's
another reason why the secret ballot can be very important in certain
well,
situations.
we don't have secret ballots and
Obviously not.
No,
thank
but
heavens for that.
But I think a lot of these dynamics that Michael was pointing towards, I think that they're especially powerful nowadays because of a really important fact. And this may have been true in the past too on the other side, but it's this astonishing preponderance of one side of the political spectrum in some of the most important institutions. So the best example is the universities. And you can see this statistically, especially in the States. They've done lots of studies on this, where they look at the percentage or the ratio of Republicans to Democrats in certain fields, or Democrats to Republicans, let's say. And in a lot of fields, you'd think it'd be like 2-1, 3-1 Democrats, Republicans. But it's actually in a lot of humanities fields like 30 or 40-1. And in some fields, in that particular study, they couldn't find any Republicans in
not a
anthropology
single
or
conservative in
communications.
the whole
Right.
field.
So it's this incredible skew. And because of that, so you have that in academia, arguably in media too, be interested in your experiences. And you combine it with these dynamics of sort of people's natural tendencies to ostracize people who are not in their tribe, then you get this result that if someone stands up in academia and says, in the old days, they'd said, I'm gay, maybe they would have been ostracized. But now it's like they stand up and say, I am anything that's not kind of left, or I would say even far left at the moment, you're in big trouble. You might not be instantly fired, but your career is in big trouble.
Another part of the dynamic is people wanting to feel like good people. As we reflected before, human nature isn't good. It's not evil either. It's just kind of
I don't know.
I
think the default human nature is evil.
Well, we can come back to that.
Has aspects of goodness,
we can come back to that. But in the end, people want to feel like they're good. And so if something is presented as virtue, and it's kind of widely agreed, or it seems to be widely agreed that this is virtuous, then people are going to be attracted to saying, I believe that, or I think that, because that marks me as a good person.
Do you think that people want to, or do you think people want to be perceived as good?
Well, it amounts to this. It amounts to the same thing when it comes to what they say.
It's probably a combination, right? There's probably like a spectrum of cynicism. Some people are probably true believers. I mean, this goes back to what we were saying before about how many of the administrators at universities really believe in the ideology.
Yes.
And I think for some of them, it really is like 100% they're all in. For some of them, it's sort of like, I don't really believe this, but I half believe it, and it'll help my career. And maybe there are a few for whom it's 100% cynicism.
Because doing the people do the easy thing, whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing. So the thing, stimulus response, the thing that gets me an easy result is the thing that I will do.
Yeah.
And if that's doing the right thing or being seen to be the right thing, then,
Yeah.
then that's what I'll do.
I also think
but if it's the
yeah.
other way, then I'll do the other way.
There's another dynamic which I find very discouraging, whereby people will pretend that they agree with something because they know that they're going to do it. In other words, they're faced with all these incentives. Like, you have to say that this is the case, that there's no such thing as a male and female, because otherwise your career is going to be screwed. And so rather than, I actually kind of trust the people more who just tell me, I didn't believe that, but I did it because I was
went
terrified.
along with it. Yeah.
But I think what some people do is they say, oh, I'm going to go along with this. And it's very uncomfortable for me to think that I'm going along with it, even though I don't believe it. So what I'm going to say is, I actually believed this all along. I've always thought that there was no such thing as a man and a woman, male and female. Right?
Well,
and then you get more true believers.
There's all of these Republicans now saying, yeah, we love tariffs.
Exactly.
That kind of
Exactly.
thing.
It's a great example.
Yeah. And isn't Putin a good guy?
Yeah. And we hate the Constitution, apparently, or like we're fine with threats to the Constitution.
It's just
And
like,
rule of law, who cares about that?
oh my God, these people are just awful. But yeah, because doing the right thing is hard, then there are a large number of people who will not do the right thing.
And I think it becomes particularly hard when people who you may have had common cause with over something suddenly take a divergent view on something else. And I think that's now happening on the, whether we can call it the right, I don't know, but the kind of those of us who were kind of confronted by wokeism, shall we say? And I think they ultimately come in two kinds, or at least two kinds. One is the more libertarian-leaning people, of whom you're certainly one. I would count myself one as well, because it had this kind of creepy authoritarian aspect to it, where if you didn't agree with them, they were going to come for you and try and make your life a misery.
Specifically, I'm lost. What specifically are you referencing there?
The kind of woke worldview that really wants you to conform with it, and so now the woke worldview is perhaps in retreat, certainly in America with Trump coming to power. There's a lot of people saying, "Yay, that's a wonderful thing." But a lot of those people then will also go along with Trump on a whole lot of things that I won't, like, Zelensky being a dictator and Putin being the good guy and all of this, and
Ukraine started the war.
Ukraine started the war, and voting with Iran and North Korea in the UN.
I thought it was really funny. He said Zelensky was a dictator, and then all of his acolytes said, "Yeah, Zelensky a dictator," and then a week later he kind of walks it back. Because like he never really meant in the first place. And then I kind of, where are all you people who said Zelensky is a dictator? And then Trump says, I didn't really mean it. Well, it's like, this is the problem with following some sort of thoughtless demagogue. It's like one of these, the communists back in the day who, had a deal with Hitler, and then we hate Hitler because
okay, so this is actually one of the things we plan to talk about. So Trump, because you wrote a column on this recently. Well, you wrote a column really on sort of National and ACT, two of the parties in the current governing coalition here in New Zealand, and how that might intersect with what's going on in the States. So I'm worried, basically, because I think that people are going to start, initially when Trump came in, people were talking about a vibe shift, and it's going to sort of spread outwards into the Anglosphere.
Certainly be one of them.
Is going to be defeated. But then it sort of changed into, once sort of the true horrors of Trump's foreign policy became clearer, I think people in Canada especially, it was a very dramatic effect in Canada, started to think, okay, well, it's because Trump said that thing about, Canada's going to become the 51st state. It's not clear whether that's a joke, but he's been very rude.
Well, what is definitely not a joke is the 20% tariffs he slapped.
Exactly, huge tariffs. And I mean, that's not really the kind of thing you should joke about as the president of the United States. But anyway, so, and he said, Governor Trudeau, so he's mocking the prime minister. And maybe Canada's not that important in the grand scheme of things, but it meant that in
Canada.
Well, exactly. In Canada,
that's how you treat your closest ally.
Exactly. So Trump then becomes sort of anti-Canada. And then everything Trump is associated with, including the anti-woke movement, becomes anti-Canada. And you see this huge effect in the Canadian election, polling for the next Canadian election, where previously the Conservatives had this huge lead with Pierre Poilievre, something like 20%, 25% clear of Trudeau and the Liberals. And now the Liberals are having a leadership election. But suddenly you see in the graph, the Liberals are just caught up. I mean, it must be some kind of record of like fastest catch up. And it's because the Liberals have more successfully identified themselves with Canada, basically. And so I'm worried about, so what do you think about this in New Zealand, right? Because is there a worry here that all this anti-woke stuff, which we think is still quite necessary, people are going to start to associate that with Trump, and hence as with sort of this foreign American stuff.
In New Zealand, no. For whatever reason, New Zealand seems to have be outside of that whole sphere. So you've got you see reform in the United Kingdom. You are seeing in Australia, you're
Yep.
seeing the possibility of Peter Dutton, who was quite an iconoclastic, controversial figure, standing to win election.
Very conservative, no Trump figure.
No, very conservative. Well, he's Trumpish in a way, in that kind of that iconoclastic way, but he's not.
But he's not going to
Trump
say
in
that New Zealand ought to become a state of
No,
Australia.
he's much more ideologically consistent. Certainly Canada at one point was looking like they'd have a chance to throw Trudeau out. For whatever reason, New Zealand's never we've got a left leaning, relatively left leaning conservative administration in Christopher Luxon's government, so we've kind of been a little bit out of that shift. So no, I don't think that's going to play out in New Zealand, but also the Trump stuff is evolving so fast that it's difficult to, because I wrote a column at the end of last year saying I didn't think it made a huge difference whether it was Trump or Biden, or Trump and Harris as it possibly was then. And clearly I got that wrong, because I did not foresee Trump's impact in the area that he's having. I was kind of judging him by what he did last time. So no, I don't see that that's necessarily going to have a big flow on here, but I'm also a bit wary about being too quick to judge Trump's historical impact. He's done an awful lot in a month, 5 weeks since he's been in office. It was that, what do you think of the French Revolution? It's too early to tell.
Yeah,
even he wasn't talking. He was talking about the '68 riots, not the Napoleon. But let's see where this gets to in another 6 weeks. Trump is so erratic. I mean, he could implode. He always looks like he's won the hamburger away from a stroke. We'll see what happens.
he could always, radically come back towards a more normal position as well.
I think you just forget some of the things he says, right? So like the whole plan to make Gaza into a luxury resort,
been and gone.
Added to the fact that it just seems kind of incredibly implausible. I think that one's just going to.
He hasn't been talking about Greenland recently either, I don't think.
So, yeah,
but
no, it's just like who's that? You take him seriously, not literally.
But I think that a lasting impact will be now that the Europeans will be very nervous about the reliability of the American alliance, at least while he's president. That could change with the future administration. And maybe that's not a bad thing as well. Actually, maybe the Europeans should start to think.
But if we're thinking, because we were talking before about free speech being a cultural issue, and the restrictions on free speech being essentially cultural rather than legislative. So, given the impact, so I don't think Trump's going to have the degree of impact in New Zealand as he might have in other Anglosphere countries. He will have an impact to an extent, sure. So, I mean, how do you think that cultural shift is going to impact on something like free speech, on the ability of academics to say stuff? I mean,
this is my fear. I mean, initially I thought, actually, I was never that hopeful. Like a lot of people were saying to me, there's this huge vibe shift in the States, and it's going to roll over the rest of the Anglosphere, and it's going to hit New Zealand,
which is what often happens with vibe shift.
It sort of often happens, but I always think that there's an exception, which is that when things are perceived as American and right wing, then especially in Canada and New Zealand, maybe to a lesser extent in the UK and Australia, there's actually more resistance to it because we define ourselves as like not crazy right wing Americans.
It happened with Reaganism. I would say, and Thatcherism, although albeit implemented by the Labour Party and not the National Party here.
Mulroney in Canada was very similar to Reagan.
Yeah, so there was that, and certainly subcultural shifts have played out in New Zealand. But
the counterexample, I guess, is thinking of things like the Iraq War. So the sort of George W. Bush push for what did he call it, a freedom agenda. That was resisted quite staunchly in Canada and New Zealand on the grounds that we're not sort of American warmongers, right?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that in countries that did participate, like Australia and the UK, there was also a lot of pushback against that. And I mean,
I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to work out like what happens in these situations. And my sense now is actually that Trump is going to. I'm kind of worried because, as I say, like I think it's very important that people are free to speak, and I think it's very important that we reverse some of the really radical things that have happened over the past few years, really just by force of bullying rather than sort of people winning arguments.
So here's the
But I just think that people are going to start to think, oh, that stuff is all like Trump, and so it's discredited.
that's one interpretation. The other interpretation or possibility is that I think that the success of the cultural left in imposing its will on things like academia and the institutions and the media and free speech, the pushback from that from the right is not to re-establish the integrity of those institutions.
No, it's to build alternative institutions.
It is to impose their own either alternative institutions, but potentially to impose their own control on those same institutions. And that's going to be very hard because.
Hold on, are you
the
saying this
march
is the
through the
pushback that's happening in America, or it should happen, or what?
I get the sense it is happening in the United States.
Okay,
I mean,
yeah.
you look at Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post, I
Yeah.
think is a classic example. You look at Elon Musk and Twitter, again, is a classic example. Well, that's perhaps a little bit unfair to Elon Musk. I don't think he's turned Twitter into the right-wing version of what the previous guy had.
Certainly very different.
He's made it very open again.
And then you could add things like the new College of Florida, right, with Ron DeSantis and others basically taking over particular universities and really doing, for me, like the same thing as the woke people were doing and just imposing certain courses.
Different kinds of
But
censorship.
from a right-wing point of view.
Yeah. So those Enlightenment ideals are being eroded, and as you said, the ability to have freewheeling conversations with people you disagree with, those things are being eroded, and in a sense, they are being eroded because of the success of the cultural left. And it is to some extent it's the success of this postmodernistic cancer, where there is no truth. The truth is a function of the cultural environment in which you live, and if that's what you think, then you don't believe in free speech. You believe in creating an epistemology that gets you the outcome that you want, whatever it is. And so you want to control the institutions. It's kind of like and I don't think that the right have that same degree of intellectual cohesion. I don't think there is not a postmodernist equivalent.
There's no obvious ideological force.
I mean, there used to be Christianity.
There used to be
Christianity. If you go back far enough, not even that far.
That's true.
Maybe in the 50s or something. You know, they would have been saying on campuses, "You're not allowed to blaspheme or take the Lord's name in vain because that's harmful. It does actual harm to people's souls." Right?
Yeah.
And we Christians gave that up. Christians gave that up because they were basically forced to by liberals. Maybe some of them were convinced by liberal arguments, hopefully, but a lot of the time it was just they were forced to because they kind of lost the culture war in a sense. But now the side that won the culture war is imposing their own taboos.
And maybe the cultural left saw the success that Christianity had by imposing its views, and they simply replaced Christianity as a dominant cultural force.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it happened so kind of consciously, but I definitely think that this is something in Jacob Machangama's book about the history of free speech. I think it's just a natural inclination that when people become powerful, they start to think, actually, I don't want to put up with hearing that bad word that I don't like, whatever your taboo is. And then they're able to impose it.
Free speech is always better beloved by people without power than by people in power. And I think one of the big problems we have in New Zealand, like I can see in America, it's got a big enough university ecosystem and media ecosystem that certainly it's dynamic enough that it could move around all over the place. In New Zealand, the universities are so captured and the media is so captured, the mainstream media, that it's hard to see where an internal impetus would come from to change that. I mean, there could be editors who kind of see the wind blowing in a different direction and want to.
Well, maybe from the 24th most popular columnist.
But is that the case, right? So, I mean, the two major news organisations in New Zealand, so you've got NZME and Stuff.
Yep.
And Stuff definitely has a kind of a more progressive worldview, and NZME, I think, has a more conservative worldview.
But not much.
Economically,
perhaps. Yeah.
So there is. But neither of them are, and I think as a consumer of news, right? So Adrian Orr resigned. That is an objective piece of information, and
Governor of the
it's
Reserve Bank of
right.
New Zealand, just for listeners who don't know. Yeah.
Yep. So he's gone. But if so that's just an objective piece of information that both NZME and stuff will report. When you have things like maybe issues of gender or Gaza or Donald Trump, you may well find that an NZME journalist and a staff journalist and the platform and the spin-off and newsroom, they're all they're gonna report it with slightly different because they all have their own kind of epistemology that they view the world. But as a consumer of news, if I read a piece in the spin-off, I'm going to understand the spin-off has a worldview, and assuming that I'm a reason, yeah, I don't need to be that sophisticated to be able to understand what's happening. So I don't know.
Well, I agree. I mean, this is a good argument against sort of censoring people, that you should trust people to sort of be able to filter the information that they're receiving and judge for
Yes.
themselves. However, I would say that there are obviously effects of people being sort of surrounded by a media ecosystem of a certain type. So like if all of the state-sponsored broadcasters are saying or taking the same view, let's say, they have the same biases, then it becomes more difficult for at least a certain segment of the population to sort of think differently. And you get these, you get these phenomena where there are just these, these contagion effects of certain
and things
views
can easily become a monoculture. I mean, to take a concrete example, during the Ardern years, I don't recall seeing one cartoon in the New Zealand Herald that lampooned her. Not one, literally zero. And
listeners could falsify this by
at the
sending
same time, they could, but at the same time, they were relentlessly lampooning the opposition.
I know they were holding the opposition
to account.
And
so you might say, well, that's just cartoons. Fair enough, but actually, that's taking the temperature of something when you look at what is being satirized in a journal.
And yet, the tide went out on Ardern, and it went out unbelievably fast.
It did. It really did. But
did it go out that fast in the media, though?
It didn't go out that fast in the media. And now, if you compared the way in which they talk about the Luxon government, appropriately enough, it's relentlessly critical in a way that it was not about the Ardern government. So
what?
Well, so doesn't that say that those journals and perhaps those journalists are running a bit of an agenda rather than trying to give a kind of fair and balanced account of the news? Or
here's my take on that. Yes, I think that the people who write for the media tend left. I think it's quite a bit of evidence on that. But I think the consumers of media are sophisticated enough to understand and interpret that. So Ardern was very popular and I think she would have been popular even if the media had been critical of her, because by and large, the population, other than some cranky guy and stuff, the population was behind what she was doing until the point that they were not. John Key was himself often the subject of relentless criticism. He remained consistently popular until he figured he may not win and left, and who knows, he may well have won that election. So I think that the ability of so it is a cultural thing. It's a cultural thing in the media. The media tends to shift left. But I think the consumers of media, because we do live in a free speech environment, there are outfits like, so if the media goes out there and does not report on something, it gets out there.
Well, I mean, I agree. So basically what you're saying is, people can take into account agendas, and it's natural that people have agendas, journalists have agendas, and in some ways it's healthy. Like I remember when I was at college in England, I used to go into the junior common room and we had all these papers. Like internet was a thing, but it hadn't quite caught on, so we had like the Guardian. I would read the Guardian. Then I'd read the Telegraph, and I'd read the Times, then I'd read the Independent. And I knew that I would get a right wing take from the Telegraph. I knew I'd get a left wing spin from the Guardian, and that was great. But the fact is that, there were these broadsheet, respectable papers from different sides of the political spectrum, different sections of the political spectrum. And I think it's more dangerous. What we've seen in the past few years in New Zealand is basically that the sort of respectable and definitely the state-funded news broadcasters basically have taken one view, and particularly on certain issues. Like I think what the Herald is different economically to the Post. That's obvious. But I think on particular issues, they've been really singing from the same hymn book, right? On trans issues or Treaty of Waitangi, there has been a kind of restriction of what people have been able to say in these reputable fora. And then you say, well, okay, platform and reality check radio have emerged. They have, but they've emerged as a kind of fringe movement. And
as a direct result.
And that's good. I mean, that's kind of shows why capitalism is a good thing, because people have the choice to do that. But in a sense, it's still a problem that the state broadcasters are all on one side, right? Because why should the state broadcasters only represent one side?
Why should we have a state broadcaster?
Well,
shut it down.
Well, if you are
again,
there
is a more fundamental question, right? Like,
shut it down.
Shut it down and let the market decide.
But even if you think there should be, because some people think there should be a state broadcaster, okay, fine.
Yeah.
But if you think there should be,
those people
then it should be balanced,
should be
right?
pursuing a treaty-centric agenda. People who believe there should be.
Okay, if you believe that, then everybody who doesn't agree with the treaty-centric agenda are going to stop supporting state-sponsored broadcasting.
There are others, like my grandfather, for example, who was a very conservative man. He believed deeply that there should be a state-funded broadcast.
Would he believe that now?
Well, that's a good question. He's long dead, but he certainly thought that the state should provide media in order to inform people in a fair and balanced way of what was going on. So he didn't have an agenda other than he had an overly optimistic view of the benign nature of the state.
If your grandfather was alive now, I imagine if he still believed that, you would not consider him conservative, because what we consider to be conservative has evolved.
Yeah, well, perhaps.
So I would suspect that, given the views that he had back then, if you brought him into a current environment, he would look at.
He certainly probably would have given up listening to RNZ some time ago. That's right. Yeah.
All right, we were going to talk about COVID as well, but I don't think we have time for it, so we sort of censored ourselves here. There's social elements have led to our censoring ourselves. That's a shame, but
that time limitation is terribly tyrannous.
But yeah, thank you very much.
COVID was great.
What, the disease or the reaction?
COVID exposed our willingness to follow the dictates of the state.
Sure did.
It was
my
34-second take on this is that New Zealand may have been one of the only countries in the world where locking down together with border closures actually made sense, along with other countries with like very few points of entry like Norway and Iceland. I take this idea from Noah Carl, by the way. He wrote about it in about 2021. Noah Carl, he's a British sociologist.
But I suspect that Damien's reaction on the very first day of the first lockdown was quite similar to mine, which was one of utter horror that the state was
I remember
curtailing our liberties in the way
I
that
did
it did.
podcast with Jordan Williams, and Jordan Williams said there is no libertarian in a pandemic, and I said yes, there is.
Well, I was another.
If this disease had like a 50% death rate and immediately made everyone's face fall off, though, would you have been in favor of quarantine?
Yes.
Compulsory quarantine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because locking down is morally bad, and doing nothing while people die is morally bad.
Morally bad.
You need to, in that situation, you need to make a choice.
But
there was no
indication at all that it was anything like that serious by the time.
But by the time we locked down, we had some idea. But the other thing that I railed against is that there was no acceptance or understanding that locking down was morally bad. There was no comprehension
of the costs, the idea of the costs.
Not even the cost.
Well, moral costs, you might say.
Yeah.
Just it is. It's like with taxation, right? Either taxation is theft. Yes. Doing nothing to stop and people not being educated is also a moral bad. They're two moral bads.
Yeah.
So, me and Jacinda Ardern would have different subjective valuations about which one is which, but Ardern and would not conceive that taxation, taking people, the output of people's labour is bad.
Or that locking them in their houses was bad.
Well, also just the effect on the global economy. I mean, some studies have suggested that, it's actually driven a lot of poor Africans into starvation, because if we all shut down our economies, then their economies don't grow.
Well, all of that was obvious on the first day of the lockdown as well, along with the fact that people who are mentally ill were going to do it tough, that people who are living with domestic violence were going to do it tough, people who are living alone were going to do it tough.
But did our death rate decline during COVID? I'm going to fit this in the last 27 seconds because I actually did some research for once. So it's interesting because a lot of people say, our death rate actually declined during COVID, and most people seem to agree with that. But I just noticed in the month that you published your article on this, I think last December, there was a study by John Gibson of the University of Waikato, which actually is kind of a good sign because he's a New Zealand academic. And he now argues that if you adjust for population growth rates, it's now a slightly positive excess death rate. So we're actually only 7th best in the death rate stakes in terms of having a low death rate, not second in the world as we used to be.
There you
So
go.
that's actually a tiny adjustment, but it does make a lot of difference whether we save lives or whether we didn't, right?
And on that cheerful note, we will say
We have to go. Yeah.
thank you so much.
Thank you so
guys
much.
for inviting me.